Monsieur, Sedati, Kiri, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being so indefatigable at the end of a very long day. But I promise you that we will finish in time for dinner, if not a little before. This session is on economic growth and the geopolitical challenges in Asia. And I'm just going to say just a couple of words and then hand over to this rather impressive panel. I think for decades, we've assumed that Asia's economies were bound always to outperform, not just outperform, but actually race ahead of the rest of the world, especially sclerotic Europe, corrupt, war-torn Africa, and a Latin America that always seemed to punch, sadly, below its weight. Well, for many years, our assumption was right. China was able to double its economic size with each decade. For a time, India disappointed us, but it's now surpassing the PRC because the People's Republic is already suffering from its demographic imbalances. As for Japan, South Korea, the other big economies in East Asia, they prosper comfortably as the world's 3rd and 13th biggest economies, respectively. So add in the promise of Indonesia, and what's not to like? Well, the answer to that question, I think, will be given by this particular panel. It's really the state of geopolitics, and of course, the return to the White House of Donald J. Trump and his threat of punitive tariffs on Chinese exports to the United States, and indeed the prospect of tariffs on all of America's imports. But that's not the only geopolitical and economic factor worth noting. China, North Korea, Russia, and the US are all nuclear powers in East Asia, and further afield, also, of course, Pakistan and India. So the potential for misadventure is obvious, be it over Taiwan or over the Himalayas or in the South and East China Seas. Bear in mind also that with America turning in on itself, with all due respect to Kevin McCarthy, the rest of the world can no longer really count on a Pax Americana. I mean, the days when Madeleine Albright would say, you know, America is the indispensable nation, maybe those days are fading. Bear in mind also that China's ascent to equality with the United States as a superpower is stumbling thanks to its economic woes. There's not yet any Pax Sinica. Finally, bear in mind that the Ukraine war has mocked Vladimir Putin's dream of resurrecting the old Soviet or Russian Empire. In short, we are living in troubled and troubling times. Now, this panel has speakers from Hong Kong, which is now, of course, despite 150 years as a British colony, is now an inalienable part of the People's Republic of China. We have Japan, we have South Korea, which of course has its own little political problems at the moment. You still have a president, but the impeachment vote may be tomorrow. We have M.K. Narayanan, who used to be in charge of intelligence in India. And last but not least, he's probably actually the biggest person on this panel, we have Douglas Powell, who was the de facto ambassador of the United States to Taiwan. That, of course, was a title never, ever officially given. Douglas, the floor, or rather the seat, is yours. 6 to 7 minutes.
It's me.
Yes.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Thierry Montbrial and the whole team for bringing us together once again. These are colleagues we sometimes meet only once a year, but it's a wonderful time to do this. I want to start my remarks by taking us back, to the early 1990s, and then move forward rapidly to the present. In the early 1990s, China had come out of the Tiananmen massacre very much damaged, sort of international doghouse, if you will. The United States had had a victory in the Kuwait War and was emerging as the unipolar superpower. And in that period, the US would go around and talk to our friends in the region and say, where do you stand on China and the US? And they would say, please don't ask us to make a choice, but we're with you. Time progressed through the 90s. The US made some stumbles along the way. We, in my view, mishandled the 1998 Asian financial crisis. We could have done better by our friends. China did a better job of addressing the concerns of the economies of the region. Into the 2000s, China started to recover from the Tiananmen incident. Zhu Rongji took over as premier. He cast aside unproductive industries, really energized the economy, and China was on its takeoff period. And we still kept asking our friends in the region, do you choose us or do you choose China? And they kept saying, don't ask us to choose. And then you fast forward, and we're into the US invasion of Iraq, the response to 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan. And the US put more and more of its focus on that Southwest Asian pair of battlefronts, attempting to change regimes in difficult environments. And China just kept moving along its way. Then came the 2008 financial crisis. Again, the US stumbled economically, and the G20 and others helped pick us up from that period. But we were still mired in those wars right down to the 20-teens. We were not really out of it. And what happened in that period was more and more China had unevenly but effectively deployed diplomacy of an economic nature with its neighbors in the region, and greatly improved the volumes of trade and investment, mostly trade, but a lot of investment as well throughout the region. Come down to the end of the Obama administration, the Biden administration, and if you did a survey of the region and how the US was doing vis-a-vis the competition with China in the Asia Pacific, it was not a very good scorecard. The Biden administration has done a lot to improve parts of that picture in the region. If you break it down into 4 areas, I'll leave South Asia and to Ambassador Narayanan to explain to us, but the US, in response in part to our concerns of our friends in Seoul and Tokyo, strengthened those alliances. New commitments were made there to strengthen the US relationship with each of them, and also under the Yoon and Kishida administrations, actually improving relations between Japan and Korea as well, a notable achievement. The US also with Australia developed the AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US notional agreement, entente, to build submarines and do other things in the so-called Pillars 1 and 2 of the AUKUS arrangement, which, at least on the surface, looks like a strengthening of our relations with a key ally in the South Pacific. The US had ignored in the intervening years the Pacific Islands, but the Chinese move into Fiji and elsewhere in the region woke the Americans up, and we started to commit to the freely associated states agreements with our friends in the small South Pacific Islands that are dependent on outside aid. And the US got back in the game together with Australia and New Zealand to offer real competition to China. In Central Asia, the US, after the Afghan war wound down, the US lost interest. We don't have any game to play. It's really a contest now between China and the USSR. So we're not playing our role there. Southeast Asia is the most interesting because Southeast Asians have greatly deepened their relationship with China. Singapore has always been frank about don't ask us to choose between the two, but they've been giving us more and more clear warnings. And judging the behavior of the Southeast Asians vis-a-vis the relationships with China and the US, you have to look at some more subtle signals than just what they say. And if you look at the behavior of the new leaders in Indonesia and Malaysia, both of whom have had interesting relationships with the US over the years, both of them chose to make their first foreign visits to China, not to the US. There's a signal there that's important that we should pay attention to, and maybe not yet paying enough attention to it. Now, take us up to the present. Economically, we've stumbled in the region. We haven't had competition in trade and the like, and we've walked away from the TPP agreement that was being done at the end of the Obama administration. Asia went on its own way with bilateral, multilateral, and regional agreements on trade that do not include the US. The US has opted out on its own, not been excluded, but we've chosen not to be involved. And the second area is that we have so dedicated ourselves to the kind of conflicts we were engaged in Afghanistan and Iraq that we neglected the development of our Navy and Marine Corps, our upgrading of bases, upgrading of capacity, attention to the Philippines that was on and off, and now it's back on again, but we've had a very rough go between ourselves and the Philippines, which usually had been a staunch ally and partner of the United States previously. Take this all the way to the present. We look at China, which has got its own domestic problems. I'm not belittling those, nor am I magnifying. There are problems in China. But China has put itself in a very strong position as the leading trading partner of most of the neighboring nations. The Biden administration is leaving the new Trump administration with a legacy of improved security ties with Korea and Japan. Trump can strengthen those, but he's also capable of weakening them. We have a new relationship with Australia. It's all in the future. We don't know what it is now. The future may bring us stronger ties. It may just pass into history the way CETO did back in the 1950s. This comes down to an important issue then. When China looks at Taiwan, in my view, China normally says to itself, well, is it worth a fight? Are we provoked so much that we have to fight? Or if we're not provoked, is Taiwan so available to military or coercive economic or other kinds of Chinese actions that Taiwan is susceptible to being pulled back into some kind of reunification or unification with China because the U.S. is so weaker economically and militarily in the region? I think on the economic side, yes, China is stronger, and the efforts of the Biden administration, which will probably extend into the Trump administration, to identify high-tech areas that we can deny to China and sort of experiment with trying to hold China back in its technology development, give some advantages to the U.S., but we're still mostly facing an uphill battle. Where we have not made significant reforms is in our military procurement. Our Navy, Air Force, Marine capabilities in the region have not kept pace with the capacity of China to intimidate Taiwan, and therefore Taiwan is in a more vulnerable place today than it was 20 years, 30 years ago, and it's continuing in that direction. And a big test for the incoming Trump administration is, will they use the likes of Elon Musk and his reform capability and his entrepreneurial incentives and new people in the Defense Department elsewhere to improve our systems of procurement, give direction to our military to really modernize in a hurry and be less slavishly dependent on individual Congress people's specific interests in the various aspects of the defense budget, which has led to a process now that's leaving us in the dust of China's very rapid military modernization. I look forward to going into more of these in detail if there are questions as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Douglas. A quick question. Do you think that, that America could ever join the CPTPP?
Ever is too hard to answer.
Let me add, do you think China should remain excluded from it?
Well, I think China should meet the standards of the CPTPP, and China is a long way from meeting those standards. But if they can meet the standards, then they should be in there. If we can meet them, we should be in there too. But as a nation, we are still, there was an earlier panel today which discussed very clearly how our political leadership has not prepared the public for dealing with international requirements for multilateral trade agreements. No, we have a lot of work to do.
The isolationist instinct is very strong. Jean-Pierre.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you. To the organizer, to Thierry de Montbrial and AFRI for inviting me to this new edition of the World Policy Conference. Two things regarding these, the title, coming back to the title of this panel, Economic Growth and Geopolitical Challenges. I think economic growth in the coming years will depend on a number of major economies in the region. First of all, the Chinese economy. and it will depend upon the stimulus package which is going to be put forward by the Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. We don't know yet whether consumption is going to be really stimulated, because there are more and more trade barriers around China, which will have an impact on the trade flows. As you know, China's growth model is still driven by exports rather than by domestic consumptions, and the adaptation of the Chinese economy is something which will take some time anyway, and for the time being, the stimulus package has been much more aimed at overhauling local finance than really stimulating consumption. So now the good news is that I think in the region itself, we don't see much decoupling, we see more de-risking. Of course, China has tried actually embark into a project of autonomization of its own economy with the Made in China 2025 in terms of high technologies. But at the same time, and we see at the same time some other countries in the region, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, also trying to decrease their dependence upon China. But having said that, I think economic integration continues to develop. You see, for a number of years, ASEAN and China and ASEAN having more trade than China and the European Union now. So we have this regionalization of economic realization, which is also continuing to deepen. And if you look at Taiwan as which was already mentioned by Doug, there are limits to the new southbound policy that Taiwan has tried to develop in order to reduce its dependence on China. So in the coming year, that's going to be a big part of the equation between Taiwan and China. Taiwan will remain highly dependent upon the Chinese market. So that's another interesting development. Now, the final example I would give in terms of economic integration is Vietnam, which has kind of adopted a very balanced policy between China on one hand and the United States, importing a lot from China but exporting a lot to the United States, to the point that now the US has become its first export destination ahead of any other country. So, moving to the other issue, which is geopolitical challenges, actually Vietnam has managed to stabilize its relationship with China on the issue of the South China Sea. As you know, Vietnam claims the paracels, has a number of outposts in the Spratly Islands, and despite conflicting maritime and territorial claims with China, in the last few years, there hasn't been any major friction between China and Vietnam, which is quite a big contrast with the frictions which you have accumulated between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea, particularly in the South China Sea, in the Spratly area around some shoals called the Second Thomas Shoal, where in the last few years tensions have flared up quite a lot. Now, the good news about the South China Sea, since we have moved to geopolitical tensions, is that there is a willingness on both sides, both Beijing and Manila, not to escalate too much. Now, the decision, for instance, made by the Marcos junior administration not to send warships to the disputed areas, but to keep posting and deploying coast guards, Whitehall ships, I think it's a good signal. The other interesting development is the decision made by the Philippines to again resort to arbitration to settle its dispute with China. As you know, the former arbitration decision, which was taken in 2016, was very much in favor of the Philippines. And I think from a legal point of view, the Philippines will try to demonstrate that China has actually infringed UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, on many issues in the last few. Been kept in the dark on many issues, including tariff issues, but also on geostrategic issues. Now, I think overall Trump is going to adopt a more transactional policy, which to some degree may stabilize its China-US relationship with China. We have to bear in mind, actually, the first Trump administration managed to negotiate what was called a phase one agreement on trade with China. So that's something we have to bear in mind, because that's very much that's likely to be the way of travel as far as trade relations are concerned. Now, as far as Taiwan is concerned, I think Trump has been much less committal than the Biden, who, as you may remember, made on 4 occasions a commitment to Taiwan security if an unprovoked attack is started by China on Taiwan. Trump is going to put pressure on Taiwan in 2 ways, in my view. First of all, on buying more weapons, be more serious about Taiwan security and defense preparation. But at the same time, I think he will put more pressure on Lai Chi, and I'm here as maybe it's more adventurous prediction, not to rock the boat, but to stay within the envelope of the official name of Taiwan, which is the Republic of China, which is another Chinese entity or state. Finally, we have to bring maybe Europe here to some degree, and other partners of China, which I think it's interesting to see how China is trying to reach out those partners, the EU, but also Japan, and to some degree India, which I think the Indian participant will tell us more about the recent improvement of China-India relations after the BRICS summit in Kazan, where there has been some agreement on the border issue, which has allowed actually both sides to resume a much more meaningful relationship, which had been sort of put on hold and frozen for 3 or 4 years since the deadly incidents on the Himalaya in 2020. So for China, I think the interest is to sort of try to take advantage of the Trump administration to drive a wedge between the US and its allies, both in Europe and in Asia. Whether China is going to succeed, it depends very much on Trump. And Trump is also a very astute kind of politician. They may also counter-attack in proposing more subtle China policy than the one we may anticipate. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Of course, we could see Xi Jinping at the inauguration during the 20th.
Yes,
who knows? Who knows? Now, MK, could you take over? Because Douglas mentioned the AUKUS agreement. He didn't mention the Quad, which is a Japan, India, US, sorry, not the US, Australia, New Zealand. MK, the floor is yours. If you'd like to stay seated, or would you prefer to be at the podium?
Because I think may I?
Yes, you can. Absolutely. This is a free country.
As long as I have the moderator's
I give you my, I mean, how can I possibly refuse you? As long as you stick to 7 minutes. So, and there's a great big clock there. Right. So it says 48 minutes and 52 seconds there, 51 seconds. So you've got until it says kind of 41 minutes.
I thought I'd left being ordered around ever since I left school, but obviously it has 90 years down the road, I'm still having the same problem. Let me briefly touch on the economic growth of Asia, and that I start with a very optimistic note. I think Asia has emerged as an economic powerhouse by the end of the first quarter of the 21st century. Asia's mosaic of diverse nations, culture, and economic systems has helped create a vibrant continent that includes manufacturing powerhouses such as China, alongside rapidly growing economies such as India. I may not be too far wrong if I were to say that Asia's profound transformation is shaping today's global economic dynamics. 2 nations of Asia have captivated the imagination of the world more recently, namely China and India. China is already acknowledged to have the capability to become a global manufacturing hub. But lesser known is the fact that India, with the world's largest and aspiring useful labor force, is beginning to challenge China and, in the process, the rest of the world. Already a world leader in information technology and business process outsourcing, India is a force to reckon with as the world enters the second quarter of the 21st century. I would also like the audience to realize that India today has a very significant cadre of highly educated scientists and engineers, and, if I may say so, an arsenal of nuclear weapons. Allow me to take a few minutes to highlight India's progress. It has probably the world's most youthful population, the median age of which is around 25 to 26 years. Its economy has been expanding steadily, averaging 6.7%. It is today acknowledged to be the fastest growing among the large economies and has overtaken Japan to take the second place after China. It has hence earned the right to claim to be an independent pole of global power and a leader among developing countries. After many decades, the West and India appear to be in sync on many aspects of economic determinism. The US is India's largest export destination and the largest trading partner. A little over 2 years ago, India and the United States took what I describe as a significant initiative to enhance cooperation on critical and emerging technologies for the benefit of not only the two countries, but also for the world. Even more pleasing to the West would be that apart from democratic affinity and economic opportunity, given the shared concern about China worldwide, India has since shed its ambivalence and decided to participate in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, better known as Quad, which includes the United States, Japan, and Australia, apart from India. Though short of a security alliance against China, it is an integral step which binds the two countries that have a similar approach and concern. Coming to the challenges that India faces, the geopolitical challenges, it is evident that the continent faces a host of geopolitical challenges. Many date back to the Cold War era. Some have intensified during the post-Cold War period. The most important, perhaps, is the rise of China. And while there is not enough time here to dilate on all the security concerns that plague the region, I might mention the overweening threat that China poses to Asia apart from the West. Much is, of course, often made of the India-China conflict. But as somebody who's been a practitioner of the art of geopolitics for many years, I would like to say that I do not see a hot war taking place between India and China in the near future. The India-China conflict is essentially a conflict over civilization and civilizational politics. The threat that China poses to East and Southeast Asia, however, is far greater in nature. And I would say that this merits a little more dilation. I refer to the South China dispute, which involved the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan, with China intent on making the most expansive claims across the region. China's 9-dash line, for instance, lays claim to nearly 90% of the South China Sea. Next, the Taiwan Strait and cross-strait relations. I don't think I need to dilate very much on this to this audience. Third, the Korean Peninsula. The simmering dispute and its serious dimension can exacerbate geopolitical tensions in Asia, further enhance North Korea's nuclear capabilities. North Korea's hostility towards South Korea and Japan contains the seed of an enduring conflict. There are, again, some other instances which have the potential to widen the arc of conflict. Quite a few, such as the India-Pakistan conflict and Afghanistan, have, however, reduced in intensity in recent years. Suffice it is to say that Asia's geopolitical landscape harbors a complex array of challenges that have profound implications for global stability. I want to assess the fact that there are certain hidden challenges that we need to think of in this context. Countries across Asia have varying talents. Talent is today a critical factor in navigating the shores of technology in the 21st century. But it may not be enough for most nations of Asia, other than a few, such as India, Japan, and Vietnam. In a world where artificial intelligence is being touted as a key to the future, we see that AI is proving to be a divisive element, given the lack of talent available to less endowed countries of Asia. These nations face real threats from AI and threats posed by augmented cyber warfare, sophisticated disinformation campaigns, and geopolitical instability, apart from newfangled autonomous weaponry and the like. Finally, I would be, I think, right in saying that no country or continent can alone forestall or contain the impending threats that are present on the horizon. China's global trade surplus, for instance, is a systemic problem for Asia and for the rest of the world. It needs a coordinated response. This is not yet available. Anything else will not meet the needs of today, as Xi's China continues to rely on a surge of exports, especially to developing countries, to revive China's growth. There are many other threats on the horizon, including global warming, that demand coordinated responses from countries across the globe. But there's little evidence of a joint strategy to counter and combat such threats. I rest my case at this point. I hope that the discussions we have here today and in the ensuing couple of days will provide a glimmer of hope for Asia and for the West as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, okay. Thank you. It's interesting that you mentioned China's ambitions in the South China and East China Sea. You could also have added China's ambitions in the Indian Ocean, because Sri Lanka, Mauritius, you have a lot of Chinese interest there. But later on, yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. And now I think we should move to, it's not exactly a geopolitical thing, but perhaps it's a domestic problem. South Korea. Hur.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, but not quite pleased to have to explain what's going on in Korean politics. But let me try my best. Number one casualty is me, actually. Originally, we have a different speaker who happens to be a member of parliament, so I had to stay at home because of what's going on in Korean politics. And as it has been, grabbing headlines of mass media internationally, let me say a few words, explanation of what's going on in Korea.
Sorry, one quick question. Was the original speaker, was he with the president's party or the opposition?
Me?
No, the Mr. Kim.
Oh, he is a member of the ruling party.
The ruling party, yes.
Ruling party.
Yeah.
First of all, what I would like to emphasize is that this unfortunate martial law was a single, isolated individual event engineered by President Yoon and some of his high school alumni, small number of high school alumni in the army. It's mostly not consistent with Korean level of political and economic development, as well as it's not supported by mass people on the street. Let me explain a little bit more in detail. It was December 3rd, or 10 days ago. It was an ill-conceived, a badly misjudged, and unfortunate event. But it was very short-lived. It's just 6 hours. And second, not a fire was shot. Nobody was injured. So it was declared in the night, and by the morning, it's all gone. But more importantly, it's the people on the street who resist this martial law. They just voluntarily swarmed to the National Assembly, blocking soldiers from intervention, from trying to pulling out National Assembly members. And it's fair to say, actually, even the soldiers were very reluctant to obey the order, so that they are not aggressive at all, creating enough space for the member of parliament to get in. And according to the constitution, they voted unanimously, not only by the opposition member, but also some member of the ruling party who was present over there, unanimously agreed to lift this martial law. Actually, it was just 2 hours and 30 minutes after the imposition of a martial law. So what we have seen is not the decay of a democratic Korea, but rather attestation of a democratic resilience of Korea, because it's just the people on the street who said clearly no to this ill-conceived attempt. Having said that, it creates political uncertainty, and it's most likely by tomorrow, the current president is most likely to be impeached politically by the Congress first. And if he's impeached, then the ball will be passed over to the Constitutional Court. But when he will be impeached in the National Assembly, his power as a president will be suspended instantly. And then the power will go to the prime minister, who will act as interim leader until the new presidential election, which, if everything goes as planned, probably will happen around in April, or at least by May. But still, it creates some uncertainty. But I think by the tomorrow, I think most of the uncertainty will be gone, and it will be more or less a legal battle in the Constitutional Court. And another thing I would like to point out is that, yes, there was some short-term turbulence in the financial market, but basically it was contained to an acceptable degree. All the credit rating agencies like S&P and Moody all said Korean economic stability is intact, and they don't have any intention to change their rating of a Korean sovereign rating. And this is unfortunate, but we have seen this before, 8 years ago. And even at the time, despite the short-term turbulence in the market, the economy came back after a couple of months, and probably we're going to see the same thing in this unfortunate event. So that's the explanation of what's going on in Korean politics. So I think I have to go back to the main subject of discussion. As you said, Asia is the most dynamic region. In the 1970s, the Asian economy share to global GDP was like 20%. But last year, for the market exchange rate, it was 36%. And most likely, it will reach 50% in 2040s, which is what they are talking about, so-called the coming of the Asian century. But now we are facing some unfavorable winds. And basically, it's a dilemma between economic reality and the geopolitical pressure, particularly the rivalry between US and China, which is getting more and more serious. Asian economies are very closely integrated with not only Chinese economy, but also with the US economy. And now there is increasing political tension to pressure Asian countries to take sides, politically at least. For the China and most Asian countries, China is the biggest trading partner, either biggest or most significant FDI investor in Asian countries. There's a Belt and Road Initiative. There's a swap arrangement between all these central banks. And there's a lot of, many numbers of Chinese diaspora in the region. So for many Asian countries, Chinese linkage is almost inseparable. But geopolitical reality, everybody talk about South China Sea tensions and talking about Taiwan Strait, which is a flashpoint. And new development, as you know, is that now North Korean troops are in Russia, which add another layer of instability in the region. And sometimes China, although I must admit that Asia's fast development is inseparable with China's own development in Asia, sometimes China play as a sort of a bully in the schoolyard, and we need a countervailing forces, which has been provided by the US most. But now increasingly, with the new administration coming, we all know that Mr. Trump is very much transactional, and we don't know what kind of instability and uncertainty it might add on this existing political balance. And I guess the biggest concern of most Asian countries is how to maintain this economic and financial linkage with both China as well as the US without taking sides either one of them. They'll do that on their own country's interest, not by being pressured by these two giant economies, and trying to keep the stability in the region, which has been one of the building blocks for Asian prosperity up to now. And let me focus on, particularly on Korean situation. The biggest worry about South Korea is that before we have seen the Hanoi deal, when Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un sit down together, even though the deal finally broke out. And in the process, many Koreans believe that Korean authorities and people's expectation has been overlooked in the process. So the biggest worry here is that we don't want to see the repeat of that kind of deal, particularly as mentioned by speaker this afternoon. Mr. President really likes to negotiate. And now we have, as I said, North Korean troops already in the Russia, so that there's a very much instability factor in the region. And whatever deal or negotiation that incoming President Trump might have with North Korean leader, we hope that there will be very in close consultation with South Korea without skipping over Korean interest. That's number one. And number two is that we have something called Camp David Declaration, where Korea and Japan and the US all committed to more closer relationship, tripartite relationship in the region. And despite all these changes in the political government in all three countries, we hope this relationship is going to continue as a stabilizing force in the region. You might tend to forget, but it's just a 1 hour drive from South Korea capital Seoul to the North Korea. Just a 1 hour drive up in the north. And as I said, North Korea is not the North Korea before, because now they have much more nukes, much more developed ICBM, new alliance with Russia, and there can be a very much destabilizing force adding on the South China Sea as well as Taiwan Strait issue. And one thing I must add is that already Mr. Narayanan already mentioned that there is a growing importance of India in the region. It's already 5th largest economy, and pretty soon it will be 3rd largest economy. And it's sort of very neutral to both China as well as the US. So it can be very much stabilizing force in the region. Korea is also strengthening our relations with the India, of course, not only India, but all the rest of the world. And I guess India will gonna play a more important role. And there's a brief mention about CPTPP. Now that WTO is in paralysis, I think this kind of regional arrangement is very important. Now, Korea also wants to join the CPTPP. And also, even though it's not a trading regime itself, also actively participated in the IPEF. And I think all these regional arrangements, whether it's trading or just a talking shop, can play a stabilizing force in the region.
Thank you. It's quite ironic in the sense that the UK is now a member of the CPTPP.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just one quick question. If I remember correctly, Kim Dae-jung had a sunshine policy towards North Korea. Do you see any prospect of a future or present South Korean leader following the same policy, or is the action now of Kim Jong-un so much that there will never be that sort of attempt to reconcile?
I mean, I cannot say for sure, but many Koreans now believe the sunshine policy, despite its good intention at the beginning, actually earned time for North Korea to develop its nuclear missile. And now that North Korea has now new alliance with Russia, I don't think there will be a comeback of a sunshine policy. But having said that, we don't know who will be the ruling party in the next presidential election. But the current opposition party has been more sympathetic with North Korea. So that even though it's not a comeback of a sunshine policy, but probably there's a chance that they might be more lenient, let's put it that way. They might put peace over, the short-term peace over long-term stability. There's a possibility, but I don't think it's a repeat of the sunshine policy as it is.
Thank you very much. And now, last but definitely not least, Yuichi, from Japan, an island of stability. I guess, actually, if you think of the relations between South Korea and Japan historically, and also how they've changed recently, how does Japan now see what's going on in South Korea?
Thank you very much. Thank you for your introductory question. And also, I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, particularly, of course, Monsieur Montbrial and also Madame Kong, for their brilliant leadership in gathering world-leading strategic thinkers here at the World Policy Conference. My role is to discuss on the geopolitical challenges in Asia from a Japanese point of view. Next year, Japan will celebrate the 60th anniversary of the diplomatic opening relations between Japan and Korea. So naturally, Japan is preparing for a much stronger friendship with Korea. But because of the current turmoil in Korean politics, many things become even more unpredictable. So in East Asia, we see the full of unpredictabilities. So that would enhance our concerns about the future stability in the region. Even Japanese politics is becoming unstable and unpredictable. And maybe Japan is now entering into the era of political instability, ending the long time of political stability that Prime Minister Shinzo Abe actually created. But let me start my talk by focusing just 3 leading geopolitical challenges in Asia. Number 1, the possibility of the Taiwan contingency, which I already mentioned several times here. And number 2, the possibility of the North Korean contingency, another important contingency which we have to think about. And number 3, the possible impact of the second Trump administration upon the geopolitics in Asia. So number 1, the possibility of the Taiwan contingency. Security experts in Japan as well as in Taiwan largely agree that the Taiwan contingency is quite unlikely to happen soon. I mean, the overall Chinese invasion to the mainland Taiwan. China is not Russia. China has been in many ways much more reluctant in exercising its military power. In the last 2 decades, under the particularly Putin regime, repeatedly Russia used military power. But China is unlikely to do the same. In the last 4 decades in East Asia, we haven't seen the major war. So in that sense, Asia has been perhaps the most peaceful place, unlike our usual image, since the Third Indochina War, which ended in 1991. After that, we have been enjoying peace and stability there. But at the same time, Japan is now surrounded by 3 nuclear powers, Russia, China, and North Korea. So it often said that Japan is now situated in the most dangerous place in the world, encircled by these unpredictable nuclear powers. So Asia, East Asia, is full of contradictions. So in this way, it's always difficult to predict. Like the Taiwan contingency, this is also another case of the full of contradictions. Even I said that Taiwan contingency is quite unlikely to happen, but at the same time, both Japan and Taiwan is under strong pressure, or stronger pressure coming from China, combining 2 things, economic coercion and the maximum military pressure by China's military, I mean the People's Liberation Army. So now, both Japan and Taiwan are facing serious security concerns. In addition, China's invasion, or the change of status quo by military force upon the Pratas Islands in the South China Sea is quite likely, because it's quite easy for China to change the status quo of the Pratas Islands. So even though the overall invasion of China into the mainland Taiwan is quite unlikely, but still, we have so many concerns surrounding Taiwan. And also political warfare or influence operations. Chinese infiltration into Taiwanese domestic politics is another important matter which we have to think about. So in this way, China is perhaps taking much more indirect approach to try to reunify the country. So we have to think with much broader perspective about the Taiwan contingency, not just looking at the possibility of the Chinese overall invasion of mainland Taiwan. So I said that in the beginning that Taiwan contingency is quite unlikely to happen. Here lies the biggest contradiction. If we, I mean the Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, ASEAN countries are complacent in thinking in this way, it means that we have no particular reason to increase our defense budgets. But China every year is increasing its defense budget. So it means that the gap is expanding. So this means that it will become more possible for China to do something to change the status quo by using the gap. So the number 1 priority for us is to increase defense budgets. I mean, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. To do that, we have to seriously think about the possibility of the Taiwan contingency. Number 2, North Korean contingency. Nowadays in Japan, many experts are thinking that North Korean contingency might come earlier than the Taiwan contingency for several reasons. Number 1, of course, North Korea dispatched its People's Army to Russia. By doing that, now North Korean Army has much better technologies coming from Russia, particularly in nuclear weapons and also ballistic missiles. By fulfilling those gaps which North Korea didn't have, now North Korea has much stronger military capabilities. And besides, in the end of April, Russian government decided to dissolve United Nations North Korean sanction panel. With that, it's easier, much easier for Russia to transfer technologies and some of the goods to North Korea to enhance North Korean military capability. So that is a serious concern to surrounding country in the region. So in this way, we have to think about that North Korea's enhanced military capability is actually destroying previous strategic stability in the region. And of course, China has serious concern about that. The much stronger link between Russia and North Korea, and a much stronger North Korean defense military capabilities with Russian help. So in the end, I also like to talk a little bit, just a little bit about the impact of the second Trump administration upon geopolitical situation in Asia. American allies in Asia generally tend to think that a second Trump administration is not so bad thing, because it is quite likely that the second Trump administration will take Asian first policy, sacrificing Ukraine. So of course, it would be a serious effect upon the future of Ukraine. But Trump team often mentions about the importance of Asia, and China is a principal rival or enemy to hegemonic rivalry with the United States. It means that United States probably under the second Trump administration will use much stronger or larger resources upon Asia. So this is, of course, welcoming effect. And also, as I mentioned, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan need to expand its military capabilities. And we basically agree with it. So in this way, I think that Trump's Asian policy might become quite sound in trying to maintain a strategic balance between China and the United States. And that maintenance of the strategic balance in the region can be a good effect upon the future peace and stability in the region. To sum up, I like to say that there are so many unpredictabilities, but at the same time, Japan can bring some kind of stability and predictability by bridging United States with China, by bridging the liberal democracies with global South, by bridging several different forces. I think that Japan can play some important role.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's interesting. I think that the pivot to Asia by the United States began under Obama, and yet if you think about what has happened, what's kind of taken up an awful lot of American diplomatic and foreign policy time in the last decade or so, it's actually inevitably become the Middle East. I mean, it's extraordinary that, in a sense, the Middle East shouldn't matter that much to America, but it always drags American policymakers back in. Sorry, that was a slightly jaundiced note. Any questions, please, from the audience? Because we have 8 minutes left, and I invite any questions. If not, I have a question for Jean-Pierre.
There's a question over
there.
there.
Question there? Sorry, I can't.
You can see.
Ah, there we go, yes. If you can identify yourself, that would be very kind.
Hello, I'm Farid Yassin. I used to be the Iraqi ambassador to the United States. I think
Ahlan wa sahlan.
At the World Policy Conference a few years ago,
yeah,
under Obama, the concept of the pivot to Asia was raised. And my question then was, what about the pivot by Asia? So now, 8 years later, can anybody add something to that on the concept of the pivot by Asia? What are the new strategies of the leaders of the...
Interesting question. You know, in what sense has Asia's overall foreign policy direction moved?
At the time, the person who answered the question was the head of Lafarge,
yeah,
a French company. And he said he saw it very visibly in the fact that many leaders of Chinese companies were much more aggressive in the rest of the world than they had been previously.
Interesting. Jean-Pierre.
The Asian pivot
Yes, the pivot. Well, the pivot by Asia towards towards the Middle East, for example, towards Iraq.
Well, China has been very active in the Middle East, but
and also to Africa.
And Africa as well. But I would argue that actually, in the new priorities of the Chinese diplomacy today are more the Middle East and Latin America than Africa. Actually, if you look at the amount of trade between China and Latin America is twice bigger actually than between China and Africa. It's around nearly 600 billion US against 300 billion US. So, and the Middle East is a growing partner of China, both the Saudi Arabia, Emirates, but also Iran and other countries in the Middle East. So, but I would add to that actually Asian countries compete for influence in other parts of the world. So in other words, the so-called global South is also very fragmented. And we had a session just before this one with IMEC, which underscores the fact that India is also very active in the Middle East and also China, India is also active in Africa to some extent. So we see major powers also competing, not to mention Japan and countries which have been in the global South for a much longer period of time. So Asia, yes, is also reaching out other parts of the world, but there are several actors doing that, and that's part of the multipolarization of the world, and including of Asia.
Thank you. A quick question to Douglas. I mean, I think it was Jean-Pierre who mentioned the Philippines and the tensions there. I mean, Biden obviously said 4 times at least that America would defend Taiwan. Whether that's true under a Trump administration is another matter. What about the Philippines? If they become, I mean, Philippines is a treaty partner of the United States. And I'm somewhat surprised that the Philippines is going to for arbitration again, having won the first time. Why do they need to go a second time? But nonetheless, Douglas, do you think the US would actually intervene on behalf of Manila?
Well, it happens. It matters what the topic or the cause of the conflict is. I think recently we had a few months ago, we had a concern that Scarborough Shoal and related shoals would be a pretext for some kind of conflict between the Philippines and China that would draw the US in. And I can tell you that American military figures do not think that should be the beginning of the war between the United States and China. And the Chinese also felt that that was not a place where we should test each other. The Philippines went through a period of sort of testing it, and they themselves, I think in consultation with the US, decided to take an initiative to lower the temperature around the shoals. And I think the US and China both welcomed the Philippines' decision to seek some kind of conciliation on management of the existing dispute between China and the Philippines.
Do you think it's a sort of a domestic politics thing in the Philippines as well? Because, I mean, Duterte obviously had this sort of pro-China policy when he first came to power, and it seemed to change.
Well,
I would characterize Marcos.
I always thought Duterte was more anti-American than he was pro-China. Yeah. It's deep in his blood, and we had to deal with that, and it was an awkward, we didn't deal with it very effectively in my view. We've had weak leadership in our embassy since the Bush administration on, and we could do a better job with our Philippine friends than we have done in the past. But I give credit to the Biden administration, they have really stepped up to manage affairs better bilaterally with the Philippines, and you're seeing that in the expansion of access to facilities in the Philippines, improved exercise conditions, and I think the kind of diplomacy that's taking place is also keeping the Philippines strong relative to China, given the conditions the Philippines operates under, but not provocative.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, question there from Michel, I think, Michel Foucault. Foucault. No.
It's coming.
Yes, could you come back to the content benefits, possible impact on the Korean Peninsula of the last treaty of so-called global strategic partnership between Moscow and Pyongyang? I suppose it was a Russian initiative. Could you confirm that? And it's an opportunity for South Korea to observe on the field North Korean soldiers and some generals also. What is your assessment? Because it's a real shock, a change for the peninsula.
Good question. Mr. Hur, yeah.
I'm not quite sure whether it's the Russian initiative or North Korean initiative, but I guess they have a common interest. They both tried to go around all these sanctions, particularly from North Korea's point of view. There's already sanctions imposed on that country. I mean, it's the same for Russia, and they both found the common interest in having this relationship. Having said that, what I'm told by the experts is that this sort of a mutual defense agreement still has many loopholes, so that despite what appears as a close alliance, particularly from the Russian point of view, they can always walk away from the deal. But I have not seen word by word the treaty itself. And it's a severely destabilizing force, definitely. Many Koreans are shocked. And it has a potential that some kind of conflict can easily flare up to the global scale, and that's really scary. And apparently North Korea is said to get some energy as well as food, but more importantly, some technology to further develop their ICBM and missile capacities. And that's a really worrisome element of this deal. And that's the reason why that the alliance between Korea and Japan and the US, despite all the change of those people who signed on this declaration of Camp David Declaration, should be continued to be cemented and strengthened in many ways, despite the change of the government in all those three countries, because the underlying interest, strategic interest, does not change despite the change of the figure at the top.
Yeah, good point. Douglas, you had one of the...
I was just going to say there's been a studied silence from China on this agreement between Russia and North Korea. And I think the reason underlying that, although you can't ask the Chinese because they won't respond, the reason appears to be that North Korea has bought itself more maneuvering room. They've been hostage to whatever China would or would not do on their behalf, and they now have the ability to play Moscow against Beijing, which they did in the 50s and 60s, but haven't been able to do since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I think this was an opportunity for North Korea to take advantage of Russia's needs for weaponry and the like, soldiers, to get what they wanted, which was more maneuverability vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, good point. China must be pretty disappointed by its friendship without limits with Russia. I mean, given that Russia's done so badly in real terms in Ukraine, and now is no longer is under pressure to leave Syria, it hasn't actually worked out very well for China from, I think, a selfish Chinese point of view.
I just want to say that recently China unilaterally lifted the visa requirement, short-term visa requirement for Korea, and many people interpret it as a way to show displeasure toward North Korea's close alliance with Russia.
Excellent. We have run over time, and dinner is approaching, and I don't want to... Oh, there is a last question, a brief question, if you wouldn't mind, and brief responses.
Okay, very brief. Thank you, gentlemen. Donald Trump has said that any person or company investing $1 billion or more in the US would receive fully expedited approvals and permits, including, but in no way limited to, all environmental approvals. At the same time, China is raising the bar on its environmental requirements for all industries, particularly energy and hard-to-abate industries. Do you think that Europeans developing CBOM and the likes are likelier to align with China and with Asia rather than the US, and that could provoke another type of pivot from an industrial point of view?
Oh, good question. I don't know who would like to answer that.
I mean, this is all very late-breaking news. We don't know the details, but the United States Supreme Court decided last week that the massive amount of environmental reporting required for investments in the U.S. was superfluous and should be avoided. So I think Trump is taking advantage of that to turn it into something he can trade with. But in fact, it's a fait accompli versus, done by the U.S. courts.
Jean-Pierre.
Well, just two points on this issue, climate change and the COP negotiation. Of course, China is trying to reach out the European and other developed economies in order to sort of create some kind of a consensus on those issues. But there are two obstacles to really move towards some kind of consensus between China and the US and the EU on that. The first one has to do with climate finance. I think, as you say, as you may know, that China considers itself as a developing economy, and as a result, its contribution to the climate finance is only voluntary. It doesn't mean that China is not going to contribute anything, but it's really going to be on a bilateral basis, and as you know, depending very much on China's own plans. And the other issue is the carbon tax that the EU is going to introduce very soon, and which is going to be, of course, which has been criticized by China, which is going to be a new element of friction between the EU and China, including on climate change. So I don't see united front between China and the EU really taking shape. There is dialogue. There will continue to be dialogue, and but I don't think.
But the carbon mechanisms, border mechanisms, due to come in next year, or
yes,
or 26. I can't remember.
25. Maybe I'm wrong, but yeah, I've seen. I think it's 25.
I think dinner is on your minds. So whether it's on the minds of the panel, I don't know, but I think they've done a terrific job, and they deserve a very good round of applause. Thank you very, very much.